Hello, I'm Zach Kotz, and welcome to this week's edition of The Global Current. First up, staffer Bilal Bahadur on recent violence in Mexico.
Mexican authorities said that they have detained several people in the investigation into the violent events that took place on February 4th in Acapulco, Mexico, where 6 Spanish tourists were raped. Officials say that an armed gang raped 6 Spanish women who were among a group of 14, 7 of whom were men. The rapes took place as the male tourists were tied up with phone cords and bathing suit straps. Another woman, a Mexican national, was left unharmed. Lead investigator Marcos Juarez told CNN that officers speculate the victims were connected to the suspects through a drug deal that occurred a day or two prior to the incident. In addition to the sexual assault, the suspects also stole cell phones, iPads, and tennis shoes from the victims. Relatives of some of the detained suspects protested what they considered wrongful arrests. 5 of the detainees are relatives of the protesters, whose crowd was made up of some 40 people, and briefly blocked the road in Acapulco's airport. Quote, "It's been 48 hours that our family hasn't seen them. We know nothing about them. One is a nephew, and one is my brother," said Flor Silva, one of the protesters. State Public Safety Secretary Guillermo Jimenez persuaded the protesters to end the blockade in return for allowing the protesters to meet with their relatives. The incident was a shock despite the area's reputation for hostility. For years, rival groups have fought one another, giving rise to Acapulco's violent reputation. According to analysts, Guerrero State, where Acapulco is located, ranks among Mexico's highest homicide rates. As of last year, Guerrero had the highest number of gun murders than any other state in Mexico, more than 1,600 according to a federal government tally released last month. Violent episodes like this also worry tourism industry executives because of potential ripple effects which may hurt resort business throughout all of Mexico. The U.S. Department of State informs travelers that, quote, "Resort areas and tourist destinations in Mexico generally do not see the levels of drug-related violence and crime reported in the border region and in areas along major trafficking routes." Despite the seemingly high level of violence, the overall level of violence in Mexico may actually be declining. In 2012, there were about 20,568 intentional homicides across the country, which represents a 5.8% drop since 2011. Mexico's new president, Enrique Peña Nieto, has been accused of avoiding the issue of violence. According to Christopher Wilson, an associate at the Washington-based Mexico Institute, quote, "There is a belief that the criminal groups do take advantage of the media and the attention in order to create fear, basically, and therefore space to act with impunity. So the government decided deliberately they won't parade recently arrested criminals in front of the cameras," end quote. This differs from Peña Nieto's predecessor, Felipe Calderón, who handled violence by cracking down on the cartels when he took office in 2006. The violence in Mexico has left local residents and shopkeepers no choice but to rely on themselves due to the failure of government assistance. Quote, "We are going to have to rise up with weapons. We cannot wait until they keep destroying the port of Acapulco with these kind of incidents," said Sergio Mejia, who is the president of a 35-member association of restaurant and business owners in Acapulco's Bonfile Beach community. Quote, "We think the government is very timid, very slow. If there is no immediate response, it leaves us no choice but to join the fight and set up checkpoints on the street corners." Reporting for the Global Current, Bilal Bahadur.
Next, staffer Arjun Donde reports on Pope Benedict XVI's shocking resignation.
The College of Cardinals is set to elect a new pope, only this time it will be under circumstances that they have not faced in almost 600 years. In a shocking announcement last week, Pope Benedict XVI declared his intention to resign from the papacy. In the announcement, Benedict made known that on February 28 at 8 p.m. local time, he will step down as Bishop of Rome and the head of the Roman Catholic Church, charging the cardinals with the duty of choosing his successor. Vatican spokesperson Reverend Federico Lombardi stated that Pope Benedict is not resigning due to any disease, but rather the strain that his age brings during his papal duties. In a letter to the cardinals, Pope Benedict stated that the strength of mind, body are necessary, strength which in the last few months has deteriorated in me to the extent that I have had to recognize my inability to adequately fulfill the ministry entrusted to me. Pope Benedict XVI cited an inability to properly carry out his duties due to the effects of his age, thereby necessitating his resignation. Pope Benedict XVI's brother, George, echoed this statement, insisting that the papal duties were becoming more and more difficult given Benedict XVI's age. Leaders across the globe were shocked by this startling turn of events. Regardless of how many agreed or disagreed with Benedict himself or the views of the Vatican during his reign, many remain incredulous, expressing regret at the resignation of this influential man. Benigno Aquino, a critic of Pope Benedict XVI's stance on abortion, stated in a recent interview with The Guardian that he would join the rest of the Catholic world in mourning the Pope's resignation. Rumors swirl regarding who will be elected as the new Pope. For now, popular candidates seem to be Cardinal Angelo Scola, the Archbishop of Milan, Cardinal Christoph Schoberg, the Archbishop of Vienna, Cardinal Andres Rodriguez Mariaga of Honduras. It is the first time in almost 600 years that a pope has discharged himself of the office. The last to do so was Gregory XI in 1415, during a particularly tumultuous period in church history. Needless to say, the College of Cardinals will have a difficult time selecting a new pope to follow the legacy left behind by Benedict XVI. Pope Benedict XVI himself presided over a controversial period involving scandals and a growing negative image associated with the Roman Catholic Church. However, Benedict also helped to orient and integrate the papacy with the 21st century. This integration was epitomized with the establishment of his official Twitter account, a small yet significant gesture that further connected the Holy See to the common man. Arjun Donde, Global Current.
Moving to the commentary, staffer Adam Bergdorf discusses equality in Russia in the lead-up to the 2014 Winter Olympics.
We in sport are in the closet. It is still a fearful place. So we need your support, we need your education, and we need individuals to stand up and be proud and say, I'm here and I'm queer, and there's no safer place in the world than Vancouver to come out and to make a very strong statement.
That was former Olympic bronze medalist Marion Lay speaking at the grand opening of Vancouver's Pride House during the 2010 Winter Olympics. The Pride House was created by local activists to showcase the accomplishments of gay and lesbian athletes and provide a welcoming environment to out competitors. The Summer Olympics in London followed suit with their own Pride House, which was also hailed as a wonderful success. New Zealand speed skater Blake Skejerup even credited the inspirational messages at the London Pride House as a major influence in his publicly coming out. Unfortunately, the 2014 Winter Games, hosted in Sochi, Russia, will not feature such an establishment. Russian officials have rejected plans to form a similar establishment for their games. The reasons offered for their rejection of these plans range from a banal explanation that it contradicts the basics of traditional Russian values to the outright absurd claim offered by the judge Svetlana Mordovina, who ruled against the plan, saying, quote, "It can undermine the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation due to the decrease of Russia's population." Appeals are being made to the International Olympic Committee, but as the committee does not directly control special interest houses that get set up at the Games, there is little, they say, that can be done. This is just the latest event in a growing trend of Russia's crackdown on homosexuals. Currently, Russia is working to pass a law that will make it a criminal offense with a fine of up to $16,000 for, quote, promoting the propaganda of homosexuality to minors. This would include public events and disseminating literature. Madonna was actually charged under a similar local ordinance after a concert in St. Petersburg last year, though charges against her were eventually dropped. Lady Gaga has also faced legal threats after her performances there. Although Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev opposes the legislation, President Vladimir Putin has remained conspicuously silent on the matter, even though the bill was introduced by his own United Russia party. At the end of January, the legislation proceeded through the first round of voting, passing with a vote of 388 to 1, and is expected to fare equally as well through the next few rounds. The legislation has also created some stir among the Olympic athletes poised to compete in Russia next year. Blake Skejerup, a New Zealand speed skater, stated, "I don't want to have to tone myself down about who I am. That wasn't very fun, and there's no way I'm going back in the closet. I just want to be myself, and I hate to think that being myself would get me in trouble." Megan Rapinoe, member of the U.S. women's soccer team that brought home the gold medal in the 2012 Games, stated, "I had my girlfriend with me in London. If the law passes, I would definitely be breaking the law. Hopefully it won't deter gay athletes from being who they are." And aside from athletes, the continuing attempts to silence and sanction Russia's gay and lesbian population have drawn the ire of international human rights groups such as Amnesty International, whose representative Friederike Baer stated,
to make a connection between one which constitutes a crime and the other just an expression of an individual's preferences. It demonstrates an attitude, a rather negative, discriminatory attitude.
The international community should not and cannot sit idly by and allow more and more repressive measures to be piled onto the diverse Russian people. The International Olympic Committee should take a firm stand on this issue, as they have with discriminatory issues in the past. In 1964, the IOC withdrew its invitation to apartheid South Africa to compete in the Summer Olympics, eventually fully expelling the nation from the committee in 1970 due to its continued discrimination policies. While the IOC may not be able to directly influence which houses get permission to operate during the Games, they can certainly take a stand of disapproval at Russia's refusal to continue a new tradition of showing acceptance to all. The Olympics are about what unites us all as human beings: friendly competition, thrilling sport, fair play. And while tolerance and equality may not be, quote, traditional Russian values, they are traditional human values. Adam Bergdorf, Global Current.
Up next, staffer Stephanie Parenti weighs in on French intervention in Mali.
President Francois Hollande says he's battling a terrorist threat on Europe's doorstep. He says the campaign in northern Mali will take as long as necessary, but fighters are warning it'll be France's Afghanistan and its downfall.
Until recently, Mali was seen as a success story in U.S. counterterrorism efforts. However, in early January, an impatient France declared war on the rebel forces led by the National Movement for Liberation of Azawad, the MNLA, a rebel military campaign to gain independence in North Mali. There are 4 Islamic factions in the northern area who use terrorist tactics, one of which is al-Qaeda. Since then, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has deployed troops and has led the mediation efforts in Mali, efforts supported by both the MNLA and the interim president. Nigeria is the backbone of this troop contribution, and Chad is also involved, though it is not a member of ECOWAS. These positives are shadowed, however, under a cloud of ways in which this could go badly. There are 2 issues that France and the other African nations face about why the independence or autonomy of Azawad just simply cannot be granted. First, it is a haven of 4 terrorist factions, 2 of which are core groups and 2 that split from them, and all who differ religiously from the main Malian Muslims. Secondly, the quite necessary involvement in Mali has long-term consequences which will be the product of necessary resources that France and ECOWAS have to put into Mali. On the first front, there are 5 main Islamist groups in Mali. One is al-Qaeda, whose goal is to spread Islamic law and free Malians from the legacy of French colonialism. The al-Qaeda faction uses tactics such as kidnapping Westerners for ransom and drug trafficking, which also produces monetary revenue. A second group, a splinter group of al-Qaeda called Mujahideen, hopes to spread jihad to West Africa and also uses violent tactics. This group controls most of northeastern Mali. The other popular group, Ansar Dine, also has the objective to impose Islamic law across Mali. This group is centralized in northwestern Mali. The al-Qaeda faction enjoys free reign over all of North Mali as it has friends among the Ansar Dine and the Mujahideen. These 2 groups also have close ties with a third al-Qaeda splinter group, the Signed in Blood Battalion. These groups recruit within police organizations who then impose Sharia law despite existing laws. The 5th splinter group, the Islamic Movement for Azawad, IMA, broke from the Ansar Dine because it opposes terrorism and favors dialogue. This group feels it has the biggest voice of the people of Mali, who have been oppressed by their government since independence. The interesting aspect here is that all the militant organizations are of the Wahhabi Salafi sect of Islam, mainly seen in Saudi Arabia. But the Malian Muslims are of a Sufi sect, particularly a Neo-Sufi or Universal Sufi sect, who do not require adherence to the Sharia law. With 5 factions trying to vie for legitimate power, their differences in their religious backgrounds could be cause for conflict. This may be one of the benefits to seceding from the country, but either outcome fuels conflict. The implications of giving even autonomy to the northern area of Mali would be to concentrate the active terrorist organizations into one centralized region of Mali. The governments of the West African countries and France have to give significant military resources to begin a campaign to eradicate the terrorist factions of Azawad, now and after fighting ceases. This includes stabilizing it to transition back to Malian hands and potentially sending the terrorist organizations into neighboring countries, a fear that Algeria shares. Resources will have to be given regardless, but it will be much easier for the West African nations and much more popular for France to spearhead these actions with popular international support. There is a proposed UN resolution on the table, but the mandate calls for a 1-month-long term for the French-led operation to conclude in a ceasefire, and that is too short a time to solve the terrorist issue, the election process, and reconciliation between the MNLA. To begin with, France and the other involved nations would have to stay for a long time to create a joint government. They would have to join politically, giving the MNLA a stake in more of Mali than just the North. They could not form separate political parties. If the MNLA wins, we see a minority ethnic dominance with religiously different views and previous ties to terrorist groups leading. Should the current government, then there is a majority ethnic dominance. Even if the civilian aspects, institution building, police organizations, and military training did lead to good governance, there are still terrorists in the North who will take that on. This is not to paint a negative picture of the future of Mali, but perhaps the country should take a more realistic approach in helping the people regain control of their government. To begin with, they should not entertain the idea of giving autonomy to Azawad. However, they should recognize the difficulties in transitioning this government back to democracy and having to deal with the violent Islamist factions looming in the North. This has been Stephanie Parenti with The Global Current.
Finally, executive producer Laura Toledo speaks with Clark Sorensen, chair of the University of Washington's Center for Korea Studies, on North Korea's recent nuclear detonation.
All right, let's go ahead and dive right in.
Okay.
Under its new leader, Kim Jong-un, North Korea conducted its third ever nuclear test on Tuesday. Under what conditions were the previous tests undertaken? How was the international scene in 2009, the last test they conducted, and in 2006, the first?
Well, that's kind of a long question. So I'll go to the first test on October 9th, 2006. In 2006, George Bush was president. So the U.S. was quite hawkish in its foreign policy. We had a preemptive strike doctrine in those days, but we were also bogged down in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. South Korea, on the other hand, had President Roh Moo-hyun, and they were pursuing something that they called sunshine policy, which was détente with North Korea, unreciprocated aid, but no toleration of provocation. So there were tensions between the U.S. and South Korea. South Koreans felt the U.S. was trying to precipitate war on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. felt South Korea was being soft on North Korea. And so it created some tension between the U.S. and South Korea. So that was the situation in 2006. Now, during the first Bush administration, the only agreement we've ever had with North Korea, which was something called the Agreed Framework, was mutually abrogated in 2002 after James Kelly visited Pyongyang and seems to have accused them of having a highly enriched uranium program based on intelligence from Pakistan. The Agreed Framework was mutually abrogated by both North Korea and the U.S. after that. First, there was nothing, and then the Six-Party talks started in 2003. The main difference, I think, between 2006 and now is that in 2006 we weren't sure if North Korea really wanted nuclear weapons or if it was looking for the nuclear weapons program as a way of inducing people to give them foreign aid. And I think the nuclear test in 2006 kind of disambiguated that it looked like they really did want nuclear weapons at that point. Now, when we go to the second test, which was in May 25th, 2009, it was a little bit different. It was very early in the Obama administration. You know, he had been elected in November 2008, and he was inaugurated on January 20th, 2009. So in the U.S., we had a Democratic administration, whereas in the 2008 election in South Korea, Young Bak Lee, who's the president until February 25th, when he'll be succeeded by Park Geun-hye, was president. So his policy was much more hardline on North Korea because the sunshine policy had been perceived as a failure. I think the South Korean people were disillusioned by the 2006 test when they were giving aid to North Korea, and they felt kind of betrayed by all of that. So with the Young Bak Lee administration in place, the U.S. and South Korea were, on the same page in the playbook, I guess. What's interesting about that test, it followed an April 5th missile test, and basically it didn't give newly elected President Obama any room to maneuver or formulate a new policy or anything. And that seems to be a pattern with North Korea, that they like to do these things at times of political transition, so it's really hard for their adversaries who come up with policy. So that was 2009. And that test was more successful than the 2006. So now we come to the 2013 test, the one that took place last week. And again, you see some similarities. The timing was shortly after the inauguration of President Obama's second term. It follows a missile test. There was a missile test on December 12th, 2012, and that missile test was a three-stage missile. And the North Koreans have been saying officially that their goal is to be able to reach the United States with nuclear-tipped missiles. But missile technology is fungible. That is, what they used for satellites can also be used for ballistic missiles. And so it seems like they've made progress both in their nuclear weapons program and in their missile program. The thing that they're probably missing is the ability to miniaturize their nukes to be able to put them on actual missiles. But nobody knows for sure. And also the last nuclear test, the one in December, might have been a highly enriched uranium test. It'll take the experts several weeks, if at all, if they're able to tell. The first two were plutonium bombs, which are technically easier to detonate, but North Korea's plutonium stocks are limited, whereas highly enriched uranium, Siegfried Hecker, the nuclear physicist at Stanford, saw a very advanced facility in 2010 in North Korea. So that means that they'll probably, if it's highly enriched uranium this time, and nobody knows if it is, it may well be a kind of nuclear bomb that they can produce en masse, lots of them. So that's kind of what it is. The Obama administration has kind of had a policy of no negotiations and continued sanctions. So there are whole sanctions that have been passed by the UN Security Council for the past 10 years, and China has supported those sanctions, although there's a lot of suspicion that China hasn't really been very enthusiastic in enforcing them.
Okay. So North Korea described the test as a self-defensive measure against continued hostility by America. Was this test a response to the naval drills carried out by the U.S. and South Korea earlier in the day, or are there more motivations or causes behind this test?
Well, I would say, first of all, that their nuclear program is part of a long-term strategy to counter U.S. pressure with nuclear arms. And they've been working on that program for 20 years, so it's not a response to any short-term thing that the U.S. has done. It's more a long-term thing. In their interpretation, their major adversary is the U.S. They think South Korea is just a puppet of the U.S. Whether they really think that or not, I don't know, but their rhetoric states that. And so they think that really the only route to self-preservation is to be able to threaten the U.S. Now, one could easily, in a class in foreign relations, question that premise, but that seems to be the premise that they're working from.
And how does the election of a new president in South Korea affect that?
It's hard to say. Park Geun-hye, she's the daughter of the former dictator Park Chung-hee. She's conservative, but when she was running in Korea last fall, her platform was somewhat more moderate than the sitting president, Myung-Bak Lee, in that she thought that there should be negotiations, but she wasn't willing to make a lot of concessions, and she wasn't willing to give unconditional aid to North Korea. Now, North Korea has kind of not given her much room to maneuver. It's hard to see how she can make any concessions at all right now, and so it seems that North Korea doesn't see any potential in negotiating with South Korea at the present time.
Okay, and China, a traditional ally of North Korea, they joined the rest of the world in condemning this test. What does that mean for the future of their relationship? Is there any way that China could force North Korea back to the table for talks or encourage them to do that?
They probably could force North Korea back to the table if they wanted to, and at times they have. What they haven't been willing to do is force North Korea to make concessions. So, they want things to be quiet in Northeast Asia. They don't want trouble. But on the other hand, and, they don't really like North Korea. North Korea is a big headache for them, and so forth. But on the other hand, they seem to have come to the conclusion that preserving North Korea is in their national interest and in their defense industry. There is kind of a debt of blood between the two people because North Korea helped China during their revolution, and China helped North Korea during the Korean War. Another thing that it's good to keep in mind is that North Korea and Chinese relations aren't really done through the foreign ministry.
Mm-hmm.
They're done through the International Liaison Bureau of the Chinese Communist Party and the equivalent bureau of the Korean Workers' Party. So they're party-to-party relations, really, more than state-to-state relations. And also the People's Liberation Army still considers the DPRK a necessary buffer. So, you know, the people in the foreign ministry think of North Korea as a pain, but they're not necessarily the ones calling the shots on North Korean policy.
So Kim Jong-un has been in office for a little over a year now, and it has been suggested that North Korea has pursued nuclear weapons partially as a way to appease the military structure and bolster Kim's regime. Could you discuss the domestic political environment of North Korea related to issues like this? What role does the military play in the government?
Yeah, well, you know, North Korea is pretty inscrutable. Nobody really knows what goes on. Under Kim Jong-il had personal control of foreign relations and the military, and so nothing happened in those areas that he didn't approve, and probably he was behind the planning. Now the question is, Kim Jong-un probably doesn't have that much personal power, and when he first became, you know, paramount, people thought he might be a reformer, but it seems that there's a lot more continuity than change in policy. There's been no really significant change on the economic front, even though a lot of people hoped there would be. You know, there was a lot of rhetoric about improving people's standard of living, but there weren't any substantive policy changes that could have brought that about. And now with the nuclear, the ballistic missile tests or the satellite missile tests and the nuclear program, it seems like it's pretty much business as usual, and there's continuity, and there isn't really significant change in North Korean policy.
Many policymakers try to put every crisis or situation into a cookie-cutter mold, but each case has its own particularities. Given your understanding of North Korea's internal workings, which is limited for everyone, how do you think the international community should respond to the missile launches and the nuclear tests? Or what must they first take into account when formulating a response?
Well, you know, North Korea has been an equal opportunity failure for both parties. Both Republican and Democratic administrations have wrestled with this problem, and neither of them have really come up with solutions. The hawkish policy, we really don't have that many realistic hawkish options. We've tried the negotiations. In my view, the problem with negotiations is that anything that North Korea would find satisfying would go well beyond what any viable American administration could concede. So I don't see a lot of potential for negotiations in the future.
Okay, so in the next few years, is there anything else that can be done, or will the cycle continue of tests, nuclear tests, and North Korea's provocations towards the international community?
Yeah, you know, before the nuclear test and the satellite launch, I was hopeful that the new administration in South Korea would be able to make some progress in negotiation. And so one of the disappointing things about the timing of this test, both the missile test and the nuclear test, is that it makes it very, very difficult for the incoming president of South Korea to make any significant overtures to North Korea. I've always felt that probably U.S.-North Korean bilateral negotiations on the nuclear issue and leaving kind of civilian and reducing tensions and those kinds of issues to the North and South Koreans themselves might work. That's kind of a two-track strategy. But at least for the short run, even that kind of thing doesn't seem possible.
Well, I want to thank you again for joining us.
Okay, good to talk to you.
It was our pleasure to have you.
Okay.
Have a great day.
That's it for this week's episode of The Global Current. Be sure to check us out online at blogs.shu.edu/globalcurrent. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. For everyone here at The Global Current, I'm Zach Kotz. We'll see you next week.